Thank you all for coming this afternoon. I've put a slide up here because today's not only an opportunity to talk about the Society during 2014 as it's been our AGM, but it's an opportunity to celebrate the last 165 years. The Society itself was founded on the 3rd of April in 1850, and so you'll notice hopefully through the afternoon that we're not only looking at the past, the last 165 years, we'll be looking at the present, obviously focusing on last year as part of the AGM, and we'll also be looking to the future. And I hope over the tea break some of you get an opportunity to have a wander around the council room, which is at the back of the library. We've got lots of different memorabilia for the last 165 years and some interesting facts about things that we're doing at the moment and also in the future. Hopefully you've all managed to see the itinerary for the afternoon. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce Jennie Campbell, who's the President of the RMetS Society. Jennie graduated from Nottingham University in 1984 and shortly afterwards joined Listing Limited, which is an independent production company supplying page-ready information services to the press. Her involvement with the weather started when she was managing the production of daily weather panels for the national and regional newspapers. Jennie went on to become Operations Director for Listings Limited and was a key member of that team, the directors who built the business up and then sold it on to the Press Association in 1996. After the sale of Listings Limited, Jennie joined the Press Association as Director of the PA's Enterprises Division and was involved in setting up the PA Weather Centre, a joint venture with Meteorological, a Dutch-owned weather business, which was established to provide weather services to corporate and industrial customers as well as the media. Jennie subsequently became Director of PA Weather Centre, now known as Meteor Group UK. Meteor Group.
Correct, Meteor Group UK.
Thank
absolutely.
You. And in 2005, when the Press Association acquired Meteor Group Consult, she took over as Managing Director of the entire weather group. And in 2006, the Meteor Group Consult business was rebranded Meteor Group and is now Europe's largest private sector weather business. And you'll hear more about that in Jennie's talk this afternoon. Jennie became President of the Royal Meteorological Society in October 2014 and is here today to give her presidential address on the private sector in Europe, market development and challenges for commercial weather companies. So over to Jennie.
Super. Thank you, Liz. Okay, lovely to see you all here today. Thank you very much for coming. So I have the somewhat dubious honour of being the first, or certainly one of the first presidents of the Royal Meteorological Society who isn't actually a meteorologist or indeed a related scientist. As you've already heard from Liz, I am actually an arts graduate. I understand from Liz we've had some astronomers in the past, but I think it's safe to say I'm probably the first arts graduate. However, for the last 17 years, I have worked in the business of weather. For the last 10 as MD and subsequently CEO of Europe's largest private sector weather business. I have become engaged with the world of weather and really quite passionate about the contribution that the private sector can make. So today I'd like to talk about the role of the private sector in the provision of weather services in Europe and about some of the challenges to the growth of that market. But I'd like to start with the good news, with the successes, before I move on to some of the limitations on the growth of the market. The private sector first emerged in the 1940s and 50s in the US, which had a much more liberal data regime. It wasn't until the 70s and 80s that we saw any really significant activity in Europe. There is very little formal research available on the value of the European market for commercial services. The information that I'm showing you here originates from work done by RMetS, which is the trade association for the private sector, and also information that I've gleaned from some of the companies working in the sector. And that information suggests that there are around 50 private sector weather businesses operating in a European market valued at between 300 and 400 million euros. It's estimated that over 50% of that market is now serviced by the private sector, with the balance serviced by the national Met services. You'll notice the number of players and the value of the market is considerably smaller than it is in the US, but more of that later. So over the past 20 to 30 years, we have seen the emergence of some very substantial private sector players. Not surprisingly, the largest of these companies are based in territories that have the most open data policies. So in the US, we have the Weather Company, much better known as the Weather Channel, was renamed as the Weather Company in 2012. And the Weather Company is the largest private sector weather business in the world. The bulk of its revenues do actually come from its broadcast activities from the Weather Channel, but its commercial arm, WSI, and its recent acquisition, Weather Central, are active in media, aviation, marine, and energy markets. And then number two, based in Japan, is WNI, or Weather News International. They're active in commercial services globally, but the majority of their revenues do come from their domestic markets in Japan. And the market leader in Europe is Meteor Group. Established in the Netherlands in 1986, Meteor Group now has operations in some 15 countries across Europe, Asia, and the US. And this geographic spread is a key differentiator for the private sector. Whilst the national Met services are pretty much exactly that, national in focus, with some exceptions, the private sector is international. Therefore, private sector companies can invest in niche industry bespoke product development with the expectation of recovering that investment from sales into a pan-European, even a global market. This brings down the cost of the services to the customer and also introduces sophisticated weather tools into less developed markets. Excuse me. So WNI operates in 15 countries. The Weather Company, the Weather Channel, is very strong in the US, but is also present in the UK and China. And then finally, StormGeo. Now, StormGeo is the number 2 private sector weather business in Europe, and they also have a very broad geographic spread with operations in some 15 countries. The emergence of the private sector has created a competitive landscape that has driven innovation, the development of industry bespoke services, contributing to safety, sustainability, and even profitability. And I'd like to illustrate this with just a very brief overview of just some of the sectors where the private sector has made a contribution. So onboard weather routing systems, launched around 15 years ago, are an innovation driven almost entirely by the private sector. WNI, Meteor Group, and StormGeo, which fairly recently acquired the US shipping business AWT, these businesses provide the leading products in this sector. And efficient route planning improves safety for crew, vessels, and cargo. And it significantly reduces fuel consumption and CO2 emissions. So fuel accounts for more than 60% of total voyage operating costs for a typical scheduled container service, and effective route optimization can make a huge difference. So just a small example, on a single voyage from Rotterdam to the Panama Canal, taking into account ETA and vessel speed, fuel savings worth something in the region of $50,000 can be made, obviously with the commensurate savings in CO2 emissions. So of the 20,000 ocean-going vessels globally, approximately half now have these onboard routing systems. Weather services are crucial in the offshore industry, from exploration and production through to construction and operations, ensuring safety, increasing efficiency, minimising environmental impact. Some of the very first commercial services were developed for this industry in the early 50s, and since then, increasing competition has driven significant advances in the development of decision support tools. The sheer diversity of these tools is the result of a competitive market and of the sheer number of suppliers in that market. So, tailored location-specific forecasts for construction vessels, oil rigs, drilling platforms, and survey vessels globally. These are the core services we're all familiar with. But beyond this, we now see a huge diversity of products available to this market. You know, everything from tracking sea ice and iceberg drift, helideck motion forecasts, forecasting the dispersion of oil spills, even customized tools for protecting coral reefs. Whoops. We've also seen a proliferation of specialist suppliers in the energy sector, in the traditional sectors, generation, distribution and trading, but probably most significantly in renewables. Between 2005 and 2012, the percentage of energy production from renewables in Europe grew from 8.5 to over 14%, and the private sector responded to that with an equivalent growth in the number of specialist providers in that sector, covering all areas of renewables activity. Site assessment, construction, operations, maintenance, power output, and solar. Roads. It's winter road maintenance, a topic very close to our hearts here in the UK. Every winter seems to bring a new drama, which is always very comprehensively covered by the tabloid newspapers. The UK spends around 180 million annually on winter road maintenance. So an average road network, just very generally, costs somewhere in the region of £25,000 for one single night's gritting. So minimising the number of treatments in a season significantly reduces costs and also the environmental impacts. Again, a competitive landscape in the delivery of road services has driven development of ever more accurate proprietary roads models and decision support tools. Route-based forecasting is one of the latest developments, using a combination of high-resolution weather forecasting with survey information from salting routes to provide a continuous forecast of road temperature and conditions, facilitating selective salting along any given route. Over 60% of the UK roads are now forecast by the private sector. And I talked about the private sector's ability to export innovation to new markets, and roads is a really good example. Many European countries still do not use sophisticated road forecasting technology and don't have road weather systems embedded in their roads. Obviously, an example of this is Eastern Europe, where you would expect that, but even in more sophisticated territories like Germany, some 50% of those towns and cities that are responsible for their own winter road maintenance don't have winter road centres in their roads. But this is changing as a result of the activities of the private sector. The leading provider, the leading private sector provider in this sector now has hundreds of customers Europe-wide and is exporting the latest roads forecasting technology to all of these new territories. Rail, we see a similar picture in rail, where a number of the national networks around Europe now take services from the private sector, including the bulk of the industry here in the UK. Services, again, focus on safety, reducing delays, optimising maintenance activities. But it's no longer about just supplying forecasts. It's about supplying impacts. It's not necessarily about what the weather's going to do. It's about what it means for your business and for your industry. And again, competition and choice has benefited the customer, driving innovation not just in the range of services available, but also in the technology used to deliver them. So you have now these bespoke decision-making tools on web, on platform, on tablet and on mobile platforms. And then finally, aviation. I've talked a little bit about how the private sector has driven innovation and cost efficiencies in some key transport sectors. Well, I thought I'd just dwell a moment on a market that isn't yet open to the private sector. So currently, the private sector does provide services for operational planning and winter maintenance to airports and airlines. However, the core civil aviation services, what are known as the ICAO Annex 3 services, remain the remit of the National Met Services, and it's a valuable market. In 2004, Eurocontrol produced a report on aeronautical Met costs, stating that overall, civil aviation paid some €380 million for en route and terminal Met services in Europe in 2002. I don't have any more up-to-date data. I'd love to know if anybody else there does, actually. It would be really good to know that. But I think it's safe to assume that the cost remains somewhere in that ballpark. Also in 2004, the Single European Skies Initiative recommended that aeronautical information services should be organised under market conditions. And in 2006, the Eurocontrol, which was what you can see here, the Eurocontrol Performance Review Commission recommended the development of the contestability of MET services to improve efficiency and reduce costs. So long term's looking pretty long at the moment. However, the benefits identified by the PRC remain relevant. The introduction of competitive tendering would undoubtedly increase efficiency and significantly reduce the costs of the ICAO services. A number of the larger private sector players are now certified under EU regulations to provide the ICAO services and are lobbying hard to open up this market. Okay, sorry about the terrible buzzword. However, it is a useful term, and it's clear that, big data is going to have a huge impact in the world of weather services. Increasing volumes of available data and computational capability is facilitating the delivery of actionable knowledge for decision makers in a whole new range of sectors. It's fueling a new surge in product development in the weather services market. So, for example, in insurance, where weather accounts for fairly small-scale weather events, actually, account for fairly substantial losses, work's being done to find a statistical correlation between past claims and weather, to build a model to predict claims up to 2 weeks ahead, supporting policy pricing, loss and fraud prevention. In retail, we see new predictive analysis tools emerging, modelling how weather impacts on buying behaviours for use in logistics, managing stock, staffing, advertising, etc. We've even got someone looking at how weather affects mood and how that plays through to people's buying behaviours. In the Netherlands, where 55% of the population live in areas prone to flooding, work's been done on harnessing big data to support flood control. So integrating weather data from the traditional, the digital sources, precipitation, radar, etc., but bringing that together with non-traditional sources, such as maintenance data from sluices, pumping stations, locks and dams. And you may remember the sale of Climate Corporation in 2013 to Monsanto for a staggering $930 million. Their weather insurance product was based on big data, with Climate Corp analysing 3 million new data points from 22 different data sets daily to calculate pricing and payouts. And finally, big data, certainly in meteorology, is getting ever bigger. There has been an explosion in new ways of gathering observed weather data, just some of them here. Commercial sensors on commercial planes, cars, trucks, smartphones, domestic weather stations, even social media, crowdsourcing data via Twitter, comment on weather events, pictures of weather events. And looking to the future, private enterprise will play a role in both gathering this data and developing applications for its use. The potential market for customised weather tools is enormous. We've all heard the number that 35% of the world's GDP is weather affected. Indeed, it's hard to think of a sector that isn't somehow weather affected, from the sublime to the slightly ridiculous. I had to include my favourite here. This is pigeon racing. Apparently pigeons get disorientated by radar from the sun and they get lost. That must be a boy pigeon, otherwise the map would be up the other way. So what's the point? What is the point I'm making? Well, the point I'm making here is that our public weather services cannot provide tailored weather products across so many sectors, requiring specialist knowledge in a European economy worth 14 trillion. Private enterprise is crucial, and we must create an environment in which it can flourish. So, back to those market sizings that I showed you at the beginning. As you can see, the European market is relatively immature in comparison with the US. Between the early 90s and the mid-2000s, it's estimated that the US market for commercial services grew some 17% annually, in comparison with just 6.5% for the European market. And the main drivers of this differential, well, there are different views, but my view very clearly is that it's open data policies and the legislative landscape around the role of the National Met Service. As you'll be aware, the National Weather Service in the US does not engage in commercial activities and makes data available free at marginal cost of distribution. As a result, small business and entrepreneurial activity has flourished. You have more than 250 companies in a market valued at somewhere between 1 and 1.8 billion euros. But here in Europe, the landscape is very different. Access to data remains complex and, in some cases, prohibitively expensive. And the competitive landscape in many countries is overshadowed by the national Met services who do engage in commercial services. During the 70s and 80s, selected European governments started to introduce a more corporate or commercial model for some of their public sector bodies, including the Met services, whereby they were encouraged to generate revenues from commercial service to supplement their funding. Here in the UK, we saw the passing of the Government Trading Funds Act in 1973, giving these public bodies the authority to use their receipts to meet their outgoings. Inevitably, this distorted the emerging commercial markets, which were dominated by strong Met Service brands with access to significant resources, including data, and who were actively targeted by government with generating commercial revenues. As a result, they were not incentivized to encourage private enterprise when it could mean losing revenue to competition, and where any benefits to the general economy in terms of tax returns were not credited to them. And it did not create an environment where open data could flourish, with wholesale data providing one of their revenue streams. So, a little background to the data landscape in Europe. Sorry if this is a bit dry. I'll get through it quickly, hopefully. In 1995, the European Met Services agreed that a limited subset of internationally exchanged data, which we all know as the WMO40 data, should be available free of charge. But this did not include the key high-resolution local data or radar or models, all of which are necessary for the development of bespoke industry specialised services. All this data remained chargeable. And ECOMET, the European interest grouping of NMHSs, was formed to manage this market for data and act as a one-stop shop. It was clear even then that the issues of availability and cost of data would be a significant barrier to the development of the market and of the private sector. Therefore, in 1999, the private sector across Europe set up its own trading association, RMetS, to lobby for open data. I should declare my interest here. I was actually chairman of RMetS between 2008 and 2014. However, the open data agenda was gathering momentum amongst policymakers around Europe, driven by the principle that this data is funded by the taxpayer, so it should be available to the public, and that wider reuse of data would stimulate economies generally, entrepreneurship, innovation, employment, and ultimately tax returns to government. Therefore, in 2003, the first PSI, or Public Sector Information Directive, was passed, which provided that all PSI in areas covered by the directive, which included Met data, should be free at marginal cost of distribution, and there should be no anti-competitive activities such as favourable licensing terms or cross-subsidies. However, there was a fatal flaw in the plan. Whilst recital 14 of the directive encourages member states to stimulate their public sector bodies to make PSI available at marginal cost of reproduction and dissemination, Article 6 gives PSBs the right to charge for their PSI, generating an income that should not exceed the cost of collection, production, reproduction and dissemination, and there's the key phrase, together with a reasonable return on investment. In other words, the Met services could pretty much charge whatever they wanted for non-WMO40 data. So whilst availability was enforced, prohibitive pricing became an equally effective barrier to usage. The directive was reviewed in 2013, but despite extensive lobbying from RMetS and the private sector, this loophole wasn't closed. The revised directive has strengthened the rules around transparency, so PSI providers now do have to, or can be asked to, account for how they arrive at their charges, but there is ultimately no control on that charging. So, where does that leave the European data landscape some 12 years on from the first directive? Well, the open data agenda has gradually gained ground in parts of Europe. So some nations have embraced the spirit of the directive and are no longer charging for metadata. That includes the Netherlands, Finland, Sweden, Norway, and Iceland. Elsewhere, data charges have been reduced and selective data sets made available free of charge, and the UKMO's Data Point initiative is a great example of that. And some MET services, led by the Netherlands in 1999, and now including Germany, Norway, Finland, and Sweden, have actually withdrawn from the competitive markets. The positive impact of these initiatives was set out in the POPSIS report in 2011, a European Commission study on the pricing of public sector information. And the KNMI illustration here is probably the clearest, as it actually quantifies the benefits. And as you can see there, albeit the Netherlands is a small market, the turnover of the private sector increased by 400%, employment in the private sector by 300%, and perhaps the most significant point, extra tax gains within the period amounted to some 35 million euros. And it's no coincidence that the number one and number two private sector weather businesses in Europe come from these territories. Meteo Group was founded as Meteo Consult in the Netherlands in 1986, and StormGeo was founded in Norway in 1997. However, KNMI and METNO are the exceptions and not the rule. Outside of a very limited number of countries, the data landscape around Europe remains a barrier to the growth of the market. You know, I invite you to explore the EcoMet catalogue to get a feeling for what the level of charging is, though I do warn you it's a rather fiendishly complex beast. But just to give you a flavour, these are just a couple of hypothetical examples based on the work the General Secretary of Primet did in 2013. So in Poland, a small general services startup would need to spend over 100,000 euros annually on data, and that's just to get started. You know, that's a major cost for a business that has yet to build any customer base. A business in France focused on roads forecasting would need to spend more than 250,000 annually on the basic data requirements. And as for the larger players, a significant pan-European or global business seeking the highest resolution data, you know, OBS, radar, global and mesoscale models, could expect to incur costs of somewhere between 1 and 2 million euros annually. There has been progress, but it is not fast or far enough. So, where do we need to be? Well, to answer this question, I'd like to look at a US initiative that I'm sure some of the guys in the audience will already be familiar with, the Weather and Climate in Enterprise, which proposes a synergistic relationship between public, private and academic sectors against a background of open data. I've already said that our public weather services cannot meet the demand for tailored, increasingly specialised services for the huge range of sectors affected by weather. But similarly, the private sector cannot provide national and international data collection or generate global national weather, numerical weather prediction models. And the core science and innovation relies very heavily on the work going on in the academic sector. We could envisage a cooperative relationship between the public, private and academic sectors to deliver the optimum outcome for both product and market development. The government provides data collection and global models. The academic sector provides education and research. And the private sector creates the tools, providing innovation, customization and tailoring for corporate and industrial markets. And I'm sure you will also be familiar with this, but in the US, the AMS has established a commission on the weather, water and climate enterprise that describes its remit, amongst other things, as promoting a sense of community between government entities, private sector organisations and universities, fostering synergistic linkages between and among sectors, and engaging the government, academic and private sectors on pressing strategic issues on behalf of the society. But this synergistic relationship at the heart of a healthy market that encourages innovation and entrepreneurship can only really be truly successful against a backdrop of open data. So in conclusion, despite the barriers, the private sector in Europe has, I think, proven its worth. It has driven a genuinely competitive market, innovation, and cost efficiencies. But there is so much more that can be done. We need to create a legislative environment where the public sector is incentivized to support market development, to make data available, ideally leave value-added service provision to the private sector, or at least where they have their own commercial arm, to ensure that it is completely separate from the public task. We need to encourage the weather enterprise model to create a mutually cooperative environment between the academic, public and private sectors where they can all bring their different skills. But most importantly, we must address the fragmented, complex and expensive data landscape in Europe, making access to data both easier and cheaper. And there endeth the lesson. Thank you very much.